Just a quick note to again acknowledge all of the speakers that we just heard from and marvelous demonstrations of the impact that the support from the foundation have had for them in their research and the progression of their research, but also for them as individuals, and how the support from the foundation sustains the creative science that we're so interested in fostering. And it is actually a delight to have this be multi-institutional. It was a real pleasure to have speakers from both UC San Diego and the University of San Diego, which is our partner institution here. So before I begin to introduce our speakers, they're the panelists today, I wanted just to make a statement about how critical we feel support from foundations is today in terms of the progress for science. Back in the 60s and 70s, about 70% of the science that was conducted in the United States was funded by federal agencies. According to AAAS, just a couple of years ago, that number has fallen to the mid-40s. About 44% of the science that's done in the United States is funded by federal agencies. That's a huge gap. And industry is interested in some of this. We've heard from, in the nanobioengineering arena, some interest from industry where there's a clear, direct application for some of the fundamental research that's being done. But much of what's done, there isn't that immediate outcome and an obvious application and such a short-term gain. It's the long-term gain for science that we're really looking at in terms of the types of research that the foundations support. And so we think it's really critical that we understand the value that the foundations bring, a little bit more about the process for getting some funding. And I'd like to hear from our panelists today about their individual foundations, emphases, and why they think it's important to fund basic research, and help us demystify that process. So I've asked each of them to just say a little bit, to speak to whatever they would like to by way of an introduction. And then we'll also have an opportunity for the audience to ask any questions or to ask them to highlight things that you think might be important for people to hear. We thought we'd start with Gary Greenberg, who's the program officer for science at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Gary?
So I'm a program officer at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. I've been there for 8 years. Previous to that, I did funding for 5 years at a foundation we started. I've been funding for quite a while. And one advantage I have in funding is I have had a foot in academics and industry, as well as foundations. So I think it's good perspective to have worked in those other areas. I have a very good understanding of the difficulties of funding, and so it makes me have more empathy for those faculty members, especially young faculty members, in getting funding. But let me tell you a little bit about the foundation just to set the stage. So we have conservation and science are the two largest programs at the Moore Foundation. The science program funds fundamental basic research, and we have a couple of funding models. One is we do some very large projects, one being, for example, a 30-meter telescope, which was a $250 million project from Moore and a $1.5 billion project overall. We then have the major way that we fund it are called initiatives. And so in the science program, we have 3 initiatives. One's in quantum materials, one's in symbiosis, another in science learning. And the third area where I fund is a much smaller portion of money, but it's really for looking for high impact projects that we fund as individual projects that don't have an overall strategy. And I say this because I think every foundation is different. And so when you're thinking about going to a foundation, talking about funding, it's really good to understand what they do, what their goals are. And it's really all about kind of goal matching with foundations in terms of kind of getting funding. The other aspect to the introduction is just that foundations are different than funding, and I think we've heard this before, especially from some of the speakers, than funding at federal agencies. I think in general federal agencies, you may never even meet your program officer. You basically apply, get a grant. At our foundation, although we do open calls, the type of funding I do is I source all my grants. So I seek out individuals, and then we work together on putting proposals together that fit both of our goals. And so in the funding that I do, it's non-competitive. By the time we get to that stage, I become the advocate within the foundation for your grant in particular to get it funded.
It's really important to understand those remarkable distinctions, I think, across the foundations.
Yes, and so the other aspect of this is relationships, and I heard this by a couple of speakers as well, that developing a relationship with foundations is really important, especially with program officers. Program officers, program directors, program managers, lump them all in the same, but they actually are the ones that take your proposals forward for approval. So relationships are very important, and the fact that what you don't want is to have the interaction from the foundation standpoint should not be transactional. I think, for example, NSF, NIH, it's a transactional interaction. You apply, they decide if you're going to get it or not. In many cases, foundations are here in perpetuity, and so the relationship building is really important over the long term, where you may not align with the priorities of foundation today, but in 3 or 5 years you might. So those are really important things, and they really distinguish foundations from federal government. And then every foundation is different, and really fully understanding what foundations are looking for is really important when seeking them out.
Thank you, Gary. That's wonderful. Next, if we could hear from David. You might have to do a microphone exchange there. David Steuerman is the Science Program Officer at the Kavli Foundation, and I just remind you, you are sitting in the Kavli Auditorium. David?
Thank you. So yeah, thanks, sir. I think that was a good model for how to introduce ourselves, so I'll start. My background is in physics and chemistry. I am the nanoscience program officer for the Kavli Foundation. I had a similar trajectory. I pursued molecular electronics as my PhD at UCLA and Caltech, did a postdoc at Santa Barbara, learning a lot about quantum, and then I became a chemistry professor at the University of Victoria. So I got to learn all about committees, what it means to have infrastructure on campus and things of that sort. And so I think going back to kind of what foundations are about, it's important to the Kavli Foundation, all of my colleagues, of which I'll also emphasize, I think, a theme amongst my panelists, our teams are small. All of my colleagues are scientists. Many are past faculty members. We were at one point experts in our narrow field, and now we're responsible for a lot more. But we're it. I mean, the science team at the Kavli Foundation is like 4 or 5 people, kind of depending on how you count on it. We're responsible for the science aspect of our portfolio. And don't get me wrong, we're backed by all the folks that make sure we do compliance right and get our agreements right, and another team that focuses on public engagement for science. In particular, Kavli, we have funds that we give away every year, and we have a plan and a strategic plan and so forth, but we also know, we're keenly aware that a lot of that money, albeit now it might only be 40%, 44% of the scientific budget, but a lot of that money is spent by the federal government. So a lot of the other things that I do that I think are potentially unique among foundations are we do our best to engage with the major funding communities, the NSF, the NIH, the DOE, and we make sure that informed scientific voices are getting to them and saying, this is maybe how you should build a program. This is how you should spend $1 billion on the National Quantum Initiative. This is maybe how the National Brain Initiative, the International Brain Initiative should go. And we're there to bring talent to them, to give them really the best advice that they can build their really big programs. And so I think, if I can just shape a little bit with regards to how some federal spending happens, make it a tiny bit more efficient, a tiny bit more effective, that is much larger than what I can spend in a given year with my $30 million or so budget. So I think that's one thing that the Kavli Foundation does. We're heavily involved in a lot of initiatives. So the National Quantum Initiative is one that I've been working on the last 3 years. But the other thing, the primary instrument that the foundation directly funds science is Kavli Institutes. So in that case, we fund Kavli Institutes in 4 distinct areas. And so I'll go back to the differences and the focus of our foundation and how many of us all do something a little bit different. We focus on nanoscience, neuroscience, astrophysics, and theoretical physics. And that was defined by our founder. Those were the fields that he was most interested in. I think we're very fortunate. They have legs. I don't think we're going to solve any of the big problems in nanoscience or neuroscience or astrophysics in my lifetime, and we're an in perpetuity organization. So I think we've got good projects to support in the future. Yeah, I don't want to spend any more time. I'll move on.
Good. David, could you, it sounds like the Kavli has taken a very strategic approach, not just on the basis of the founder, but currently about the things that it funds. And could you just talk a little bit about how would someone know that from the Kavli Foundation? How would they find out about that?
Sure. So quick. Don't go to our website. It's old. And so, but we are refreshing our website. I think I'm supposed to say that. But so we of course engage with all the professional societies. So I'm at all the APS meetings. I'm at the ACS meetings, the MRS meetings, and we support. We use that as kind of our virtual sounding board to find out, well, what's popular, what's going somewhere, what's a gap that's not being funded, not being supported, and then we internally find out like how to make that science happen. I would just encourage you to all engage with us. I imagine all my colleagues up on the panel would say the same thing. I'm out there taking a lot of temperatures to find out what needs to be supported, what big projects and programs are being supported but could be run a little bit better or do things a little bit differently. I would just encourage you to kind of seek us out. Right. Lastly, though, I will say we are confined by our mission, and our mission is to focus on those 4 areas and mostly focus on basic science.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you for that introduction. You can see how every foundation takes a slightly different approach, has different emphases and different targets. Yeah, we have the good fortune of having Sylvia Ronco here. She's the Senior Program Director for the Research Corporation on Science Advancement. And Sylvia, would you say a few words about the corporation?
Sure. Thank you so much. So I was listening to my colleagues here and trying to reflect on how it really is to work in a private foundation different than federal foundations, let's say. Long time ago, I spent a year at DOE, and it's very, very different than working at Research Corporation, that's for sure. So one thing I could say is I've been at Research Corporation for 16 years. I'm a chemist, and I was attracted by Research Corp mainly because I was a faculty member at the PUI, or at the Comprehensive University. Back then, we had a big Cottrell College Science Award program that actually funded Ray in 2009, right? But over the years, the priorities of the foundation changed. And so what I would say about a private foundation is that it can move really quickly from one program to evolving to other things to accommodate the needs of what we believe fit better the mission. So over the years, Richard and I saw a lot of change in the last decade, let's say at Research Corporation. And one of the things that Research Corporation has done really, really well, I think in the last 100 years, is to build community. So that's one of our strengths, and we use it in the programs that we had in the past and what we currently have. So over the years, the foundation decided to emphasize more the research aspects rather than research and education, as we had been doing with the Cottrell College program at the PUIs, and narrow down to two main programs. One is the Cottrell Scholar program, and then Scialog. So I'm going to let Richard later talk about Scialog, but because I'm the director of Cottrell Scholar and I'm very proud of all our Cottrell Scholars, I'm in the room, I'm going just to say a few words about it. So Cottrell Scholar started in 1994, and it was actually started under the premise, forgive me here, I don't want to insult anyone, but under the premise that research universities were not really emphasizing excellence in education. So we created this program to encourage young, bright researchers in hardcore disciplines like chemistry, physics, and astronomy to implement excellent educational practices. So this was just for research universities until 2016, when we decided, instead of having two separate programs, the Cottrell College and Cottrell Scholar, to blend the Cottrell College program into Cottrell Scholars and have a community that was more diverse, like still covering physics, chemistry, and astronomy, but where two different communities could learn from each other. So that's what we're doing now with Cottrell Scholars. So this program targets young faculty, early career faculty. They apply, there's only one chance for application, so they applied in the summer right after the third year. And so the proposals contain an educational plan and a research plan. And when we do the review process, I would say that both plans are equally important. And so one of the main goals of the program is to have an army, I would say, a really big cohort of Cottrell Scholars nationwide that are ready to implement new approaches to move the needle in STEM education. At the same time, of course, people like we saw Josh Figueroa and Ray Anderson, they are conducting excellent cutting-edge research, so they are truly the role models that we want to set in front of the classroom for the new generation of scientists. So
Excellent, thank you. And I think we've seen already today great examples
exactly.
of the products of your strategic thinking through in the development of the Cottrell Scholars program. Yeah, Richard, did you want to talk about Scilog and a bit more? This is Richard Whiner, the Senior Program Director for Research Corporation for Science Advancement.
Great, thank you.
You're on.
All right. So I just, first of all, really appreciate hearing from each of my colleagues about each of the foundations. And of course, Sylvia and I work together very closely at Research Corporation. And we have two primary programs, the Cottrell Scholar and the Scialog program. And we've heard some folks from the Scialog who've been supported from Scialog. So I thought I would say a couple things about what we do with Scialog. I'll also just briefly say my background. I'm a physicist. And before coming to Research Corporation, I've been at Research Corporation for 13 years. I was a faculty member at a small college, Pacific University up in Oregon. So I think the challenge that foundations have different challenges. And for Research Corporation, we're a very old foundation, started in 1912, but we're also a very small foundation. So we don't have a large amount of resources that we pass out. So the challenge that we always have, and it's a similar challenge to our colleagues over here, is how do we leverage what we do with our funds? How do we make them count for more? And what Research Corporation has decided is one of the key ways that we can do that is by trying to develop community, trying to create opportunities to network scientists and to get them to have more for their award than simply the financial amount. And so to that end, we started the Scialog program. And the idea behind the Scialog program was to target early career faculty, to pick a very important problem, pick themes that are usually interdisciplinary, like solar energy research, advanced energy storage, other areas like that where we think that there's multiple disciplines that are going to contribute to moving that problem forward, and then to create a workshop environment where we network people, we connect them together. So we bring together about 50 early career faculty, about 10 senior faculty who are facilitators, and then what we focus on at these meetings is discussion, discussion, discussion. And the idea is that we're going to try to create an analog of active learning. Rather than the passive conference, we want to have an active learning experience. And to make that effective, we also want to incentivize folks by holding the possibility that they can form teams, and right at the conference, they can come up with ideas. They can write those ideas down in a short proposal format in teams of new collaborators, turn it in right at the conference, blue sky ideas. And if we really like the idea, we'll support that. But at the same time, by incentivizing that ideation, we've gotten people to network together. We invite lots of other program officers to come and be involved. And a critical part in order for us to do this is that we have partners, other foundations. Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation has been a key partner. Kavli has been a key partner in supporting this process. We use data analytics to try to organize people in interesting ways. We try to create diversity of cohorts along many different axes. Large institutions, small institutions, different disciplines, different approaches, gender diversity, underrepresented minorities, different ways in which we create diverse groups. And then the basic hypothesis is if you rapidly catalyze new collaborations among people that haven't collaborated before and ask them to take on challenges with blue sky ideas, are there going to be interesting outcomes?
Fantastic, fantastic. There's such a diversity, I think, in the types of approaches across the foundation. I wonder if there are any commonalities, or are there distinctive characteristics about those junior faculty that you're interested in bringing on board and supporting? Are there things that you look for example, that maybe you wouldn't necessarily be featured through federally funded projects?
Well, so I'll just highlight one of the things. So the science program at Moore, as I said, funds basic research. But because Gordon Moore was an entrepreneur, although he didn't want the foundation to pursue technology for commercialization, we decided to have a program called the Moore Inventors Fellows. So this is geared towards young faculty within 10 years of their PhD. And it's to help them develop an actual product, an invention, early on in their career. Many universities, for example, don't use inventions or patents. I hope this is changing as a tenure package. So it is something for them to think about because it does take some time. So the funding is flexible. It's over 3 years and allows them to, in addition to their research, have funds to hire people to pursue an early invention at the research stage, but with the eye that it would be commercialized. And so I think this also brings up that foundations are fluid to some extent. Our programs change over time, and so do our areas. And so despite the fact that we say we fund basic research, this is kind of an outlier, but it's had a big impact so far on the individuals that have gotten these awards.
Just goes to show the diversity of types of funding opportunities that there are in foundations, and many people might not know that. And I'll just say that I agree with you if you're thinking that universities are a little slow in considering new science products as part of the academic review process. I was just participating in a National Sciences, Engineering and Medicine convocation on this very topic, trying to align the current values for the progression of science with the academic review process. It's quite a challenge. So it's great to have those kinds of opportunities. Other things that people want to comment on about what you look for in the scholars that you're interested in funding. That's important for us because maybe there are things we can help them with to be better prepared scholars.
Yeah, okay. So for Cottrell Scholars, I would say we're trying to identify the best, the brightest people in the fields that we support, physics, chemistry, and astronomy, that are interested not only in their research projects and their progress in that area, but more broadly. So they see it, they have a different vision for they want in their careers, and they're interested in education and leadership also. And I could say that a little like what Gary was talking about, the Cottrell Scholar program is a more traditional program in the sense that it's open to any faculty member, chemistry, physics, and astronomy after the 30 year. But we do emphasize innovation, and we try to encourage people to think outside the box and propose things like what Josh was saying, that at the stage that he applied, in the Cottrell Scholar program, that project probably wouldn't have been funded by the National Science Foundation. So, and we did fund, and we get those stories over and over. And so I think as a program director in a private foundation, we have the responsibility to push those boundaries and try to push for innovation.
Yes,
Mhm.
very good.
You want to say
Very good.
something about dialogue?
Well, I would just say that for early career faculty, we're looking for people that are bold with their ideas, that are really willing to and want to have an opportunity to take a risk.
Fantastic. Yeah. David, anything you'd like to comment on from the Kavli's perspective?
I guess one thing I'll say, so we have no open calls. So we don't traditionally fund individual investigators. So in that regard, we don't have a profile or specific characteristics that we're after because that's just not the mechanism that we use to support science. However, we do see ideas from time to time where, and this is where I'll go out on a limb and say, they're kind of tricky infrastructure ideas that maybe might fall through the gaps, or it's not some super exciting scientific experiment that's going to be on the laser table or in the lab, but it's really going to help the community. I think we've heard that as a theme come up. And so what we learned talking to a lot of different neuroscientists were neuroscience was just growing tremendously in the amount of data that folks had. And even internally amongst their own labs, there was difficulty in sharing and reproducing analysis, not experiments, but even just analysis. And so we began working with a number of neuroscientists who were interested in tackling this problem and began working on a data standard. So not the most exciting thing, not the thing that's going to you're going to run into the NIH and you say, oh my God, we're going to fund a data standard. Of course, here's the checkbook. But this was a case where for a commitment, which ended up to be a substantial one, we worked on a data standard for a few years. We got the group together. We supported them. We paid for data scientists and data engineers, something that can be hard to come by and support at universities because they're expensive. And now, many years later, now the NIH is supporting scientists at national labs or engineers to go ahead and now make this data standard be more extendable. We're beginning to show adoption. The scientists are showing that this is a great way to share data and it could work. And so that was a case where it was this gap in the community that this group identified, and we were the ones who stepped in and supported it, and then others came in as well.
So amazing. It's such a diversity of ways to move science forward, and that flexibility that you all were talking about, really looking for those niches of opportunity to advance science.
And just to add, I think an important part of that is the idea of leveraging, where a lot of times foundations start something and then another group that has more resources comes in, the federal government oftentimes. And we've seen examples of that as well, like starting a new faculty workshop for chemists, and now the American Chemical Society and NSF and others are supporting that. So it's really important sometimes getting that started and then leveraging it.
I was just going to say, so when you saw Ray Anderson's talk, that is basically what I present to my board. I find those narratives that I get from the scientists that we fund or the programs we fund, and I go, look, we acted early, or we came in the middle when there was a critical need, and look at what happened 10 years later. That's a story I tell every quarter. And I also tell stories about failures as well. And I say, this is what we're going to learn from them. And I think all of us are not afraid to fail. And we encourage you to go out and do ambitious things. And when you fail, that's okay. And we'll work with you and continue to work with you on the next big project.
Great. Well, I have a number of other questions I could ask, but let me just pause and open it to the audience. Are there things you'd like to hear from these individuals? What should you like to have them talk about, or what questions do you have? Yes.
How do you prioritize what you're going to fund?
Thank you.
Aside from the fact you have to be brilliant thinking from huge risks, and there's, in terms of like saying to everybody, but particularly the science corporation guy, out of all the many things, is there you prioritize? And is there a way of seeing that list?
Yeah. How do you prioritize what you're going to fund?
We have our president here.
Well, we have parameters where we're trying to find problems that we think there's really interesting science that can be done. So we have a community of people that we talk to. We listen to potential ideas. So one idea that's come up that we're pursuing is signatures of life in the universe. And is that an area that we can make progress in? And when we think that that's a possibility, then what we start doing is we start calling lots of different top people in the field, hearing where the areas that there are gaps, how could we focus in an effective way where we could bring early career faculty in. So a process of developing a dialogue, we will talk to probably 2 to 3 dozen top scientists and try to understand how we could make a difference. And then at the same time, we're identifying people who might want to be involved and help that in their participation. And when we think that that's coming together, that we have a critical mass, we'll go for an idea. And so we're definitely open to people contacting us and saying, this is an area of science that we think there's a real opportunity. And then we'll start to explore that if we think there's promise.
And I would add that we try to have a synergy between the two programs we have at Research Corporation, the Cottrell Scholar Community and Dialogue. So that comes really handy because we have a big community of Cottrell Scholars who are willing to and wishing also to work with us and provide feedback. So we get a lot of candid opinions and good advice from the community of Cottrell Scholars. Mm-hmm. Oh, for the Cottrell Scholar program. Yeah, for the Cottrell Scholar program, it's an open solicitation. So we get 200 proposals and we fund 24 Cottrell Scholars every year. So there is a 14% success rate. So we go through really thorough review process because it has education and research. We first screen all the proposals based on the educational plans, and only those that have ideas that align with what we want to have, that is practitioners of chemical education or science education, not really science education researchers, but people who will implement modern approaches, cures, well, so on. So only the proposals that are above the bar of education that we set for the program are sent out for review. So once we do that, mainly we send it to 6, 7, 8 experts in the research field who review the proposal. And once we have 3 or 4 reviews back, we send those proposals to our Cottrell Scholar Selection Committee, which is a group of 10 people who all together, they cover all the topic, let's say, that the program supports. So once we get to the final 24 awardees, and UC San Diego has been pretty successful in that. So those proposals have been reviewed thoroughly and are we believe, the best cohort that we can award. So we're very proud of that.
Very good. Yeah, Gary, were you going to say something about that also? Good. There was another question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Vicky Grassi, and I'm the chair of chemistry and biochemistry. And what you all do is so incredibly important to the scientific enterprise. And so one of my questions has to do with as you develop ideas at the highest level, are you ensuring diversity of thought and inclusion as you sort of bring people in to advise you to think about the next area? We know that we're combating things like lack of diversity on boards at the highest levels and various places in industry, and people are trying to correct that now. And I'm just wondering with your work how you're doing that. That's my first question. And then my second question, and then I'll sit down. And I'm interested in the failure component to what you were talking about. Because we do hear these amazing success stories, beautiful talk by all speakers this morning. What does failure look like, and then how do you learn from that and improve your processes?
Wonderful questions. So just to make sure everyone heard that, the first question had to do with inclusiveness in the leadership and the review process. And the second question had to do with, tell us about failures and how you grow from that and how you improve things from that. So I'll open it up. Gary, would you like to?
I can start.
Yeah.
I think so. The issue of DEI is coming to the forefront of foundations. So we actually, as a foundation, are looking at it we've been looking at it internally, but also now externally. And so I'd say that there are some foundations that are a bit farther ahead where they're asking specific questions about investigators, about how they promote inclusivity in their labs. But we, on our boards, for example, we try and make those boards diverse. Our board of trustees is out of our control, obviously, but they are diverse in terms of science and other careers as well. On our science advisory board, for example, we have diversity in terms of gender. We have diversity in terms of kind of their level of seniority in those areas. But I also want to point out, for example, Scialog. So in the Scialog, we've done 2 Scialogs with Research Corp. We made a very big effort to both include women, try and increase the number of women, especially in physics, which is, as you know, quite low in chemistry, as well as colleges and not the traditional large universities. To do that, we diversified our panel of experts that help us identify the fellows. So I think those are the kind of measures that we're taking right now. But I think you're going to see a lot more come out of foundation funding, how we think about it. We have quite a large program with Native peoples. And one example that we try to do in terms of diverse funding, not so much the investigators, but how we model programs, is I have a program in Alaska where we've included the indigenous knowledge holders with the scientist from the very beginning, so that the questions that we're asking, this is around sea ice, are around the questions the community would like to know, as well as the scientist going out, and not just going up there and throwing out their instruments, walking away, but actually involving the community directly in those issues.
That's a very interesting point, I think, the incorporation of diversity in the initial collaborative process to advance basic science. Wonderful point, yes.
So, okay. Go ahead. So in the Cottrell Scholar program, similar to what Gary was saying in Scialog, we have been emphasizing the diverse community. So a few years ago, we had this project where we did a survey on the demographics of Cottrell Scholars. And of course, it was not surprising that Cottrell Scholars are white men who are chemists, because that's the demographics we have for, we fund 60% of chemistry. But the white men situation is something that we're trying to move the needle and increase diversity. And so in the last few years, I had contacted individually all the women pretty much that were hired in the period that could be eligible to Cottrell Scholars, and just send emails and trying to encourage them to apply. With underrepresented minorities, a little more difficult sometimes to find the information, but we are in the lookout. When we started the new faculty workshop, that Andrew, our new colleague Andrew Fye here, was the leader on that, also was a good opportunity for us to meet the new generation of faculty, the new hires, and so it's a little easier to identify women and minorities. The other thing I did, last year I think I did this, we changed the wording of the website a little bit to be more inclusive. I work with one of our Cottrell Scholars. She's a female astronomer who gave me some advice on things to how to word, to encourage people. And we became much more clear that Research Corporation is really supportive of young scientists raising young families. And so because the eligibility calls for only one time after year 3, we learn through some of our Cottrell scholars, Jenny Ross was very big advocate for that some women wouldn't apply because they were pregnant then or they were on leave, on maternal leave. So we actually now say explicitly that for women or men who had babies in that time frame, there is an opportunity still to apply, and we've been doing
Excellent.
that. Yeah.
Good,
So,
good. Talk about failure. How do you deal with that? What does that mean to your
I'll
foundations?
proudly take the failure question
Okay.
at the moment. So I will say the one thing, just to echo, I think if you hold meetings and things like that, making sure that your co-organizers and the academic leaders who are going to do that, being sure that there's diversity in that group is critical. And I've made mistakes there, and I try to rectify them. Recently, I had a quantum workforce development workshop, and we had it was a challenge to find folks who were physicists, who were diverse, and we were partnering with OSTP on this project because they're very interested in workforce development. And I will tell you, if you work with entities like that and you show up and you only have men or you don't have a diverse group, they won't come. They don't want your report. They're going to be very strongly supportive of communities that are diverse and getting their feedback and their input into the process for when major decisions happen. So I'll just say that I would encourage everyone to kind of include folks as early as possible. I think it's the right way to do it. Quick note on failure. Kavli, when the US Brain Initiative was taking off, we were really excited about it. We played a part in it. We started to get involved with disease and neurodegeneration. We supported about three meetings, bringing scientists together for it was about a year and a half, pretty quick back-to-back meetings, trying to find out where's the exciting research going to come from. Billions of dollars has been spent on this. How could it be different? And there was a lot of interest and people were really excited about it. We held these meetings, and then eventually it kind of really moved away from basic research and moved more into translational, much closer to clinical. And the Kavli Foundation just decided, well, it was great. We're really glad we supported this community and this is the direction they want to go in, but it doesn't really align to our mission. And so we're not going to continue to support it. However, when we built that program and put it together, we of course invited a lot of other foundations and science program officers and so forth. And other folks picked up with that project. The scope creep was fine. The science was great. It just was no longer a match for the Kavli Foundation. In this particular case, I think the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative put a lot of resources behind it. We were happy to make those introductions and for that project to go somewhere. So yes, it was a failure in some ways, but I think it was great that the foundation community is just interested in supporting great science, and the money goes where I think often it should.
Excellent, excellent. Would you like to make a comment?
Just a quick
Richard?
comment on the diversity issue. I think that foundations are taking this very seriously, and we heard some about the Science Philanthropy Alliance this morning, and that's an alliance of about 30 different private philanthropies that support science. And just this last fall, the Heising-Simons Foundation, led by Cindy Atherton, who has been a very strong advocate and leader in this area, had a diversity workshop for the foundation program officers and foundation presidents, and that was extremely well attended. And I think that a lot of strong ideas came out of that, and a commitment, and so we're moving forward in really positive ways. And I think that that's an example of foundations getting together and talking among themselves and saying, well, what are you doing? What are we doing? How can we do this better? And understanding best practices. I think that's a really positive thing that is being taken very seriously by the private philanthropies.
Yeah, thank you for that additional comment. I do think that universities broadly are committed to diversity and inclusion, and so part of our job is to build the pipeline so that there will be good opportunities to be more inclusive and more diversified in those that you are supporting. We have another question over here, Maria.
Actually, it's going to be a comment about failure, which
you.
was that a few years ago, the Keck Foundation asked some outside folks to look at our grant making over about 10 years, and they said, well, we calculate about 14% of these projects that you funded just tanked. In some cases, we hadn't done our diligence correctly. In other cases, Mother Nature didn't work that way. Nice idea, but no go. But then they told us, we consider these noble failures. I love that. That way to look at them. And we also note that in essentially all of them, there were collateral benefits. So something that we look at now very, very carefully in our grant making. Okay, this is very high risk. It might fail, but can we imagine collateral benefits?
And essentially, what did you learn along the way that might not have been the primary target, but there may be ancillary things that are discovered along the way?
And I would like to add that for the Dialogue program, we have talked about what is failure for the Dialogue program. Well, we like to support high risk, high reward. So we know that some of them will not work, but the most beneficial part of Dialogue really is building community and the conversation that happen at the Dialogue. So even if the funded projects don't go that well, we know that there is a huge benefit for the community and for the science.
Wonderful. Gary?
Yeah, I'll just mention, so I fully agree, and I don't know if it's on. Yeah. So I have that view. I build into all my grants, and a lot of my funding is extremely high risk. A lot of it is high risk instrumentation, so you actually know what you're supposed to get in the end. And some of those we know are going to fail. But the idea is that I've found that because these are science-based, there's always peripheral science that comes out. So I look at risk in two ways. I look at science risk and I look at execution risk. From my standpoint, execution risk is not acceptable because that means I failed somewhere in that. I didn't do my due diligence or something else happened. But the scientific risk, I don't really consider their failures. I consider that you learn along the way. We judge, for instance, whether we continue funding. If they haven't made progress, we may not continue to fund that specific program because maybe it's not possible. But Gordon Moore told us, his comment was swing for the fences. And so that is kind of the philosophy we take. And I think the good thing about foundations, which I think the federal government has more difficulty with, is that we can take high risk. And we can take risks on individuals. We can take risk on large programs. And the foundations will continue to move along. And we don't have, as you said, overseers, Congress, looking at, what is the value of this specific research. So I think that is, again, the value of foundation.
Wonderful perspective. Yeah, good. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Yes. We'll get the microphone up to you.
Hi. High risk often comes with pretty significant ethical concerns. So I'm curious about when you review or even think about ideas that you want to pursue internally to your vetting process, how do you think through the ethical implications, the societal implications, not necessarily regulatory, I'm thinking more about ethical and societal downstream impact. And then what are your expectations for people who apply for your funding to recognize, and then how do you feed that into your measures of success? Thank you.
So I think this is a great point. And I think one thing it's really come to the forefront of the Kavli Foundation is currently kind of in discussion as to whether science and ethics should almost be a new focus for the foundation. I mean, our conclusion has kind of come to, well, if we're really doing science at the frontiers, pretty much everyone's experiment should almost have ethical implications. And if we're not, then maybe we're really not at the frontiers. And so this, I think, most came to the fore. There was work done at Yale, which made the front page of the New York Times, where Nanan Sistad, I think that's his name, he reanimated, he recovered brain activity in a dead pig. And this, of course, led to all kinds of crazy news cycles about, zombie pig brains and all this crazy stuff. But the real question was, this was a real ethical concern. And what we took note at the foundation is how much he was prepared. And this was, I think, largely because of his university and his colleagues. They had him prepped to think about the ethical implications during the experimental process, when it was thought about, when it was executed, when the results came out. He is now kind of becoming a poster child for potentially the right way to think about doing really ambitious science that may have substantial ethical concerns. And now at the foundation, we're trying to figure out, how do we make that part of our scientific decision making, and more importantly, I would say, build a community where there's bidirectional input from the general public and scientists about, here's what we're concerned about, here's what they're concerned about, and how can we co-align and make those conversations happen. And really, it kind of becomes, and I will say this is almost like a dated word, like a civic discourse. And that is a challenge in a lot of different arenas. Science in particular, I think it's a challenge, but I think it's one that, at least at the Kavli Foundation, we're really beginning to think like, no, this is critical, because we don't want to have GMO problems with what's going to be the new problem that's going to stop science from progressing. How can we head that off at the pass? And that's something that we don't have an answer yet, and we think it's going to be really hard, but it's something that we're really thinking about carefully. How would we bake it into all of the disciplines that we care about?
I don't know, do you want to comment, Andrew, on our microbiome initiative and
Thank you for raising the question, because Camille's actually coming to Scialog MND and will be our resident ethicist to bake that into the projects as we start thinking about working with impacted populations. And we want those thoughts to be present from ground zero for those that carry ethical concerns. And so this is something that we're very actively thinking about. And so thank you for coming to MND, and we'll talk a little bit more later.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, if there are any, or comments. Josh.
Back to the pipeline issue, has your foundation's thought about supporting postdoctoral positions? There's a lot of emphasis on early career faculty members and early career investigators, but what about one step below? Certainly in certain fields that maybe have a more difficult time raising lots of money, a lot of that money would be earmarked for graduate students, but yet postdoctoral people seeking postdocs want to work in those fields, usually don't have the ability to get an NIH fellowship, so on and so forth.
So is there a funding gap for postdocs in the foundation's perspective?
Well, so I'll address just, from the Moore Foundation, what we've done. Two things. So we've funded Life Science Research Foundation for many years, which is in life sciences. So they fund specifically postdocs. But one of the models I've used at a number of different places now is funding a group of postdocs that are more independent, so within like a center or between different investigators. And those postdocs, often I require them more than one mentor, but they can become more independent. It builds their careers quite a bit because they're more independent. We fund postdocs off the grants. So in general, that's part of the personnel on the grants themselves. And we don't have a general large postdoc program, but I've done this 3 times with, groups of 5 to 10 postdocs that would work within a number of different investigators. And when we talk to investigators, a lot of time they bring up exactly what you said. I don't really need the money for this equipment, but I do need postdoc funding. And so that's kind of a couple of the ways that we've done it.
Great point, Gary.
And Yeah, just comment with Research Corporation funding. A couple of things. We generally, for our programs, we don't have budgets. We allow the investigator to decide what's the best way to spend this money. And it's usually personnel. It's usually postdocs and grad students. So there's an opportunity. Sometimes it's a piece of equipment that's critical. So we defer to the investigator to try to make that judgment, but hopefully, and in many cases, there's personnel that are supported. The other thing is we have a history of helping folks who are transitioning. So in our Cottrell College program, we would allow folks to apply even they had a postdoc, but they could apply for the program because they had an appointment that they were about to assume. And we've continued that tradition in Scilog, where we have folks that are postdocs coming to Scilog because they have an appointment that they're about to assume. So we do look at the transition a little bit as well.
But also, the postdoctoral issue has come up in Cottrell Scholar conferences quite often. So, okay. So, at the Cottrell Scholar conference, we challenge people to come up with projects of national impact mainly in education, and we fund some of those. And so people have talked about providing training for postdocs, especially for the reason you're talking about, the pipeline issues. And instead of waiting until, you're an assistant professor to train you as for new faculty, in the new faculty workshop, start providing some training for postdocs. And last year we funded a Cottrell Scholar collaborative for faculty members or Cottrell Scholars to mentor underrepresented minorities who are still postdocs. So we're looking at that. We don't have the resources to provide like fellowships, but at least to provide some training. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Well, I think you will all join me in thanking them for this wonderful conversation together. Thank you.